Welcome to Sleepy Crime, the place where we gently drift into the world of real-life crime. Tonight's video is designed to help you unwind and slowly fall asleep while listening to true stories of disappearances, unsolved mysteries, and crimes that left quiet towns forever changed. Get comfortable, dim those lights, and prepare yourself for a journey through some of the darkest corners of human nature. So close your eyes, let the rain fall, and let's explore the most evil serial killers you've never heard of. A journey into the lives and minds of those who quietly terrorized the world around them. Before he was called the Butcher Baker, Robert Hansen was just another quiet boy in Iowa. He didn't look dangerous, he didn't sound dangerous, but deep inside him, something had already gone wrong. He was born on February 15th, 1939, in Esterville, a small town surrounded by cornfields and silence. His father, a Danish immigrant, was a stern and joyless man who ran a bakery and expected perfection from his pastries and from his son. There was no softness in the Hansen household, no tenderness, just flour, discipline, and long hours behind a counter. Robert was left-handed, but that wasn't acceptable in his father's world. He was forced to use his right hand to write, to eat, to exist. The punishment for failure was harsh and immediate. As he struggled to conform, his stutter worsened. At school, the other kids mocked him mercilessly. His acne was severe. His voice trembled. His eyes stayed low. He was never part of any group, never invited, never included. The girls in particular were a mystery. He watched them from afar, never brave enough to speak, and when he did try, they laughed, or worse, ignored him completely. That rejection planted something in him, not just resentment, something darker, something quiet. He grew up in silence, internal, restrained, isolated. He learned not to expect kindness. He learned that people were cruel, and he learned to fantasize about control. Robert found his escape in the woods. By his teenage years, he was already a skilled hunter. Bow, rifle, it didn't matter. He could track and kill with precision. The forest didn't judge him. The animals didn't care about his stutter. They didn't laugh when he missed a shot. There was only the pursuit, the stillness, the power. And unlike the social world of high school, here he was in control. His fantasies started changing. Hunting became more than just sport. It was release. It was justice. In his mind, he started merging the targets, the deer, the birds, the girls who had laughed at him, the boys who shoved him into lockers. They all blurred together. At 18, he joined the Army Reserve. He made it through training, but the same problems followed him: shyness, awkwardness, anger under the surface. He was honorably discharged after a short period, drifting from one job to another. In 1960, when he was 21 years old, Robert committed his first major crime. He burned down the Pocahontas County school bus garage. No one was hurt, but the fire destroyed several buses and caused massive financial damage to the school district. The motive? He told authorities he'd done it out of revenge. revenge for years of humiliation, revenge against a system that mocked him. He was sentenced to 3 years in prison. There, for the first time, he underwent psychiatric evaluation. The diagnosis: infantile personality disorder, immaturity, poor impulse control, a tendency to hold deep grudges. But he was cooperative, well-behaved behind bars, and polite. That was enough. He was released after serving only 20 months. He returned home, got married, tried to be normal. But something had changed inside him. In 1967, Robert and his wife moved to Anchorage, Alaska. It was a fresh start, a new town, a new business. He opened a small bakery downtown and quickly became known for his hard work. He was quiet, respectful, and always up early. His customers liked him. The other shop owners said he was a good man, a family man. He hunted in his spare time. Big game trophies lined his basement walls: moose antlers, mounted bear heads, and photographs of successful trips into the Alaskan wilderness. To everyone who met him, Robert Hansen seemed like the model of quiet, working-class success. But the silence around him wasn't peace. It was camouflage. Beneath the apron, behind the glasses and soft voice, the fantasies were still there, stronger now, clearer, more focused. He had learned how to blend in. He had learned patience. And soon he would act again. By the early 1970s, Robert Hansen had built what most people in Anchorage would call a respectable life. He owned a bakery that opened before dawn and served fresh bread to working-class families. He had a wife and 2 children. He attended church regularly and participated in local community events. To neighbors, he was quiet and soft-spoken, a man who preferred hunting over small talk and kept to himself without seeming unfriendly. But beneath the surface, Robert Hansen was starting to come apart. At night, he cruised the red light districts of Anchorage, parking on dim corners where topless bars and massage parlors spilled neon across the snow. He started paying for sex regularly, developing a taste for control and silence. He wasn't loud, he wasn't violent at first, but something inside him began to shift. The fantasy life that had followed him from childhood was becoming more detailed, more rehearsed. It was no longer just about watching. It was about domination and punishment. Anchorage in the 1970s was the perfect place for a man like Hansen to hide. The Trans-Alaska pipeline construction turned the once quiet town into a wild frontier of cash, chaos, and crime. Oil workers flooded into the city with money to spend and nowhere to go. Sex work exploded. So did drug use, alcohol abuse, and violence. For predators, it was open season. Many of the women working as dancers or escorts were transient, travelers from the lower 48, runaways, drifters without deep roots or family connections. If someone went missing, it wasn't always noticed right away. Some left town, some overdosed, some simply vanished. That's how the city explained it, and Hansen knew that. He was watching. He began to escalate slowly. First, it was verbal threats. He would take women back to his house or to isolated spots on the edge of town. If they disrespected him or resisted, he'd flash a weapon, a handgun, a hunting knife. Sometimes he'd tie them up, just for fun, he'd say. Some women later told friends they had bad feelings about him, that he had a weird laugh, that he liked to make them cry. Others didn't speak at all. He started keeping small trophies, earrings, necklaces, hair ties. Items slipped quietly into his coat pocket when no one was looking. He stored them in a box in his basement, behind stacks of hunting gear. Each piece was a memory. Each one was part of a growing collection. He was rehearsing.
He also had a plane. It wasn't uncommon in Alaska. Small bush planes were used for hunting trips or travel to remote cabins. Hansen had earned his pilot's license and purchased a lightweight Super Cub, just large enough for him and one passenger. Friends said he flew often into the wilderness, sometimes for days. He'd return with trophies from hunts, moose, bear, caribou. He kept a detailed logbook of his expeditions. At the rifle club, he boasted of his accuracy and his patience. "The kill," he once said, "is all about timing." His trophies from the wild hung on the walls of his home, but the ones that meant the most to him were hidden in the dark. Some of the women who survived encounters with Hansen went to the police. They reported that he'd picked them up, driven them to secluded areas, threatened them with a gun. Some said he tried to handcuff them. Others claimed he flew them into the woods and left them there for hours, terrified, cold, waiting for him to return. But the reports never stuck. Hansen was always calm when questioned. He cooperated, said he didn't know the women, called them liars, and he had an airtight alibi: his wife, his job, his routine. He baked bread every morning, had employees who saw him daily, and a clean public record in Alaska. To most officers, the complaints seemed like the ramblings of addicts or unstable women. No one connected the dots. And Hansen learned that he could get away with more. By 1975, the shift was complete. The fantasy had crossed into action. He wasn't just imagining control, he was living it. And the boundaries that had once held him back had begun to dissolve entirely. He flew deeper into the woods. He started bringing ropes, a hunting knife, duct tape. He picked his victims carefully, always women who wouldn't be missed right away, always those with no one watching. And in the darkness of the Alaskan wilderness, he was no longer a baker. He was the hunter. By the late 1970s, the streets of Anchorage had begun to whisper. It started with one girl, then another. Dancers, sex workers, waitresses who worked the night shift and walked home in the dark, women who left clubs with men and were never seen again. In a city already bursting at the seams from oil money and transience, it was easy to overlook a few lost faces. There were always new girls arriving, always stories of someone who just moved on. But beneath the surface, something was changing. The disappearances weren't isolated. They followed a pattern, and all signs pointed toward the same hunting ground, 4th Avenue. 4th Avenue was where Robert Hansen often lingered after hours. By day it was unremarkable. Tourists passed through, locals ran errands, but by night it changed. Neon signs lit up the fog. Bars spilled music into the street. Girls lined the sidewalks, some dancers, some escorts, others just trying to make rent. They wore heavy coats over sequins, makeup in the cold, and kept an eye on each other. But sometimes someone didn't come back. Her name might be Cindy, or Julie, or Star, as the club manager knew her. There were no headlines, no posters, no families in the news pleading for answers. Some had run away before, some had warrants, some simply didn't have anyone left looking. And that's what Hansen understood perfectly. He didn't pick women with support systems. He chose the invisible. In early 1980, a dancer named Roxanne was last seen outside the Kit Kat Club, getting into a truck with a quiet man. She told another girl she had a good tipper who promised her a bigger job. That was the last time anyone saw her. A few weeks later, it was Lisa. She had only been in Anchorage for 2 months, working odd shifts and sleeping at a friend's apartment. She left for a date and didn't return. Her things were still folded neatly on the bed. Then there was Sherry and Sue and Megan. Each time the stories were the same. She went off with a guy. She said she'd be back. No one saw where they went, and each time silence followed. In private, the girls in the clubs started talking. They spoke about a man with glasses and a nervous laugh, a man who offered too much money for simple things, a man who liked to talk about the wilderness. He said he had a cabin, one dancer told a friend. Said I'd be safe there. Said he'd fly me there himself. Another remembered something strange, a customer who didn't drink, who didn't talk much, who stared too long and paid in crisp bills. She said he creeped me out, like he was studying me. Still, there was no formal report, no trail to follow, no bodies. And in Anchorage, that meant no case. Hansen kept a low profile. He baked. He flew. He went on hunting trips. When anyone asked, he smiled, said he liked solitude, said the city was getting too wild. That's why he spent time in the woods. He kept his plane well maintained. He knew how to land it without leaving tracks. He picked spots with no roads, no cabins, no passers-by. There, he became someone else entirely. He brought a woman into the forest, sometimes with promises of money, sometimes with force. He tied her, assaulted her, and when he'd had enough, he let her go, but not to be free. He gave her a head start, minutes, maybe hours, just enough time to run through trees, barefoot in the cold, sobbing, lost. Then he picked up his rifle, and the hunt began. Back in Anchorage, the clubs kept turning. New girls arrived, others left. No one put the pattern together, not yet. The police chalked up missing women to drugs, lifestyle, or simple transience. There were no fingerprints, no bodies, no suspect. Only whispers in the strip clubs, and a growing list of women who never came home. But something was shifting. The darkness was getting harder to ignore. The first body was found by accident. In September 1982, two hunters were tracking moose deep in the Eklidna Lake area northeast of Anchorage. The forest was thick, quiet, just wind in the trees and the steady crunch of boots on moss. One of them spotted something strange off the trail, a torn piece of clothing, almost buried under leaves and dirt. Then something worse. Bones. A human skull, half buried, weathered by time and rain. They called the authorities immediately.
When police arrived, they marked the scene and began carefully clearing the area. The remains were skeletal. The only items found nearby were a pair of high heels, remnants of a blue jacket, and some jewelry. No ID, no personal items, just a shallow grave in the woods. They called her Eklidna Annie, because no one ever identified her, because no one reported her missing, because she was invisible. A few weeks later, another body turned up. This time it was discovered near the old Nick River gravel pit, a desolate patch of scrubland west of Anchorage, known mostly to hunters and bush pilots. The remains were in a shallow depression, partially scavenged by wildlife. Again, the scene was bleak. No ID, only bones, fabric, and fragments of a bullet. Investigators began to worry. Two bodies, both young women, both found far from town, both clearly murdered, and both buried with a kind of lazy contempt, just enough dirt to cover, not enough to conceal. Then came the third. This one had a name. She was Sherry Morrow, 24 years old, a dancer who'd gone missing months earlier from the Wild Cherry Bar downtown. Her co-workers remembered she'd lifed with a customer who promised her fast cash and a private modeling gig. She never came back. When her body was discovered along the banks of the Knik River, she was fully clothed, but the evidence was clear. She'd been shot. There were no signs of restraint, no bruises on her wrists, no gag. But the bullet wound told the story. It was from a .223 caliber rifle, a clean kill, like someone who knew how to hunt. By now, police had 3 bodies. They were from different parts of town, but all shared similarities. Women who worked the night scene, no known family in Anchorage, buried in remote places outside the city. There were no shell casings, no weapon, no suspect. But investigators started asking harder questions. Who in Anchorage had the ability to get that far off-grid? Who had access to a plane? Who hunted in those areas? And who had reason to target women from 4th Avenue? They created a task force. But it moved slowly. Anchorage PD had limited resources, and there were other crimes to handle. Burglaries, assaults, the usual churn of a fast-growing city. And some officers still thought the victims had brought it on themselves. Meanwhile, Robert Hansen baked cinnamon rolls. He smiled at customers, he paid his taxes, and he listened to the news. He heard about the bodies. He read about them in the paper. He even discussed them with friends at the rifle range. "Sick world," he would say. But in private, he was collecting trophies. He kept a hidden stash: earrings, bracelets, Polaroids. Each piece carefully stored in a false ceiling panel above his basement workbench. His logbook grew longer, not of animals, but of women. He marked their initials. He noted where he left them. Tiny X's on a hand-drawn map of the Alaskan wilderness. And he was getting bolder. He began offering more money, more elaborate stories. He told one girl he was a photographer for a modeling agency, told another he needed help with a private project for a hunting magazine. He charmed with his awkwardness, glasses, stutter, the quiet bakery owner who didn't quite fit in. And when they agreed to go with him, sometimes willingly, sometimes at gunpoint, he took them away from everything. Into the woods, into the cold, into the place where he was in control. Back in town, fear had started to spread. The girls at the clubs were talking more now. They knew something was wrong. Too many empty lockers, too many missed shifts. A few stopped working altogether. Others carried knives. One girl said, "There's someone out there hunting us." She was right. But the city still wasn't ready to believe her. Not yet. By early 1983, Anchorage was holding its breath. Whispers had turned into warnings. Women were locking doors they hadn't locked before. Dancers refused jobs that took them outside city limits. And at the edges of town, near gravel roads and hunting trails, bodies kept appearing. Some had names. Most didn't. The authorities had begun compiling a list. Young women, all under 30, last seen in or near downtown Anchorage. Dancers, sex workers, runaways. Girls who'd left behind more than a purse or a whispered story. She went off with a guy. He said he had a plane. She thought it was a modeling gig. No signs of struggle. No witnesses. Just silence. Then came the body of Paula Gaulding. She'd gone missing in 1982, another dancer from 4th Avenue. Her remains were discovered in the Matanuska-Susitna Valley, partially buried in a shallow grave. Like the others, she'd been shot with a .223 rifle. Again, no shell casings. Whoever had done this knew how to clean a scene. Her clothes were intact. Her jewelry gone. No ID. She was added to the growing list. Sherry Morrow, Eklutna Annie, Paula Gaulding, and others still unnamed. Detectives knew these weren't random killings. The locations were remote, yet specific. Each victim had been placed there with care or contempt. Always far from roads, always hard to find. It was no longer just a string of disappearances. It was a hunting pattern. Yet even with the bodies stacking up, the police were divided. Some investigators pushed hard, convinced they were dealing with a serial predator, but others still dismissed the cases as runaway lifestyle problems. There was no public press conference.
No FBI involvement. The fear remained underground, spoken about in strip clubs, whispered in women's bathrooms, passed from one tired voice to another. Robert Hansen watched all of this unfold. He was calm, he was careful, and he kept baking. In the clubs, the girls created their own warning system. They described men to each other, gave nicknames, shared stories of close calls. Some remembered the stuttering guy. One girl said he had a plane. Another said he offered her $300 just to take pictures. They didn't know his name, but his awkward politeness unnerved them. He wasn't loud or aggressive. He was quiet, contained, like a snake before it strikes. He smiled too much, one said, and he never blinked. Despite their fear, they had few options. Work was work, rent was due, and some girls thought they could handle it, until they couldn't. Hansen had perfected his method. He'd lure women under a promise: money, modeling, adventure. Sometimes he used a gun from the start. Other times he waited. He'd take them to his house first, then force them into his plane. He flew them out to the Knik River area, or further north, into the Denali wilderness. There, far from help, far from sound, he let them run. Like deer. Like prey. He gave them a head start, just like in the stories he'd told hunting buddies. Then he'd track them through brush in riverbeds, always patient, always with his .223 rifle slung over one shoulder. If they cried, it didn't matter. If they begged, it didn't matter. He had rehearsed this moment too many times. By now, at least a dozen women had vanished. Some bodies had been found, most had not. And still there was no warrant, no arrest, no news bulletin with a sketch or suspect description. Hansen remained a ghost, a man who knew how to live in the quiet, a man who'd been underestimated his entire life, and that was his greatest weapon. Back in Anchorage, one detective was beginning to connect the dots. He'd mapped the disappearances, studied the timelines, noticed the similarities in how the victims were taken, where they were found. It wasn't enough for a case, not yet, but it was enough for suspicion. He made a list of men who hunted, men who owned planes, men with records. And Robert Hansen's name was on it. It was only a matter of time. It was a gray morning in Anchorage on June 13th, 1983. A driver heading down the 6th Avenue noticed something strange. A young woman, barefoot, with her hands behind her back, frantically trying to wave him down. She was clearly in distress, bruised, shaking, still in handcuffs. He stopped. She jumped in the truck and begged him to drive anywhere, just away. Without hesitation, he took her straight to the Anchorage Police Department. The woman was 17-year-old Cindy Paulson, and she was about to change everything. At the station, Cindy was understandably shaken, but her account was detailed. She explained how the night before, a man had picked her up downtown. He looked unassuming, average height, thinning hair, glasses, a slight stutter when he spoke. He offered her money to spend some time with him, but once she got in the car, he threatened her with a firearm and took her to his house in a quiet Anchorage neighborhood. There he brought her into a downstairs room and restrained her. She described the basement in detail. Wood paneling, a pole in the center, hunting trophies on the wall. She said he told her he was flying her to a remote cabin the next day. That morning, he'd driven her to Merrill Field, a small airport used mostly by bush pilots. He was preparing a small aircraft for takeoff. She waited for a moment, then ran. Police listened, but not everyone believed her. She was young, and she worked the streets. something that, at the time, made it easier for authorities to dismiss her claims. But one officer, Greg Baker, took her seriously. He brought her to the airport. There, Cindy identified the exact plane. She even recalled part of the tail number. The aircraft was registered to Robert Hansen, a local bakery owner with a small family, a clean reputation, and no current charges against him. But to Detective Glenn Floth of the Alaska State Troopers, the name stood out. Hansen had been flagged before. Years earlier, Hansen had faced charges related to violence and attempted abductions. In one case, a young woman had claimed he tried to restrain her in his car. In another, he'd allegedly followed a woman with a weapon. But nothing had stuck. He was quiet, married, ran a bakery. Judges and juries didn't see a threat. They saw someone awkward, not dangerous. But now, Floth saw something else, a pattern, and a possible link to the growing number of women who had gone missing around Anchorage. Despite Cindy's vivid and consistent testimony, police had little to act on legally. Hansen denied the allegations. He admitted to meeting Cindy, but claimed she was trying to extort him. He had a friend who offered an alibi, saying they were working on home renovations that morning. Without a warrant, they couldn't search Hansen's home, and without physical evidence, there was no arrest. Hansen was released, but the story didn't fade. Detective Floth began building a deeper profile. He reviewed past disappearances, young women last seen in Anchorage, often known to be in vulnerable situations. Some had been found in shallow graves, others never recovered.
Floth connected the geographic pattern. Bodies discovered along remote Alaskan rivers and isolated areas. All were places that required transportation, often by air or long back roads. Robert Hansen owned a plane. Robert Hansen hunted in those areas. And now a young woman had escaped and pointed directly to him. It wasn't enough yet, but it was close. Cindy Paulson's escape was more than luck. It was a break in the silence, a moment where someone survived and spoke. Her courage brought light into the darkness Hansen had relied on for years. But now Floth needed more. He needed a legal foothold. He needed confirmation. And he needed to convince a judge that Robert Hansen wasn't just a suspect, he was the man who had been quietly terrorizing Anchorage. That's when he turned to federal help. Detective Glenn Floth had been patient. He'd tracked cold cases before, murders that seemed impossible to connect, witnesses who vanished, paperwork buried in cabinets. But this was different. This case had urgency, and now, finally, it had a survivor. Still, Robert Hansen remained free. Cindy Paulson's story was compelling, but not enough for a search warrant. Her word versus his. No forensics, no direct link to the string of missing women. And yet every instinct told Floth that Cindy's escape had cracked the surface of something far larger. So he reached beyond local law enforcement. He called the FBI. At the time, criminal profiling was still a young discipline, but the behavioral science unit had begun to formalize what seasoned investigators always sensed, that patterns could reveal psychology, that serial predators often followed routines, and that understanding the why could help find the who. Floth laid out the knowns. Women had been vanishing from Anchorage's 4th Avenue district for years. Some had been found in remote areas, shot with a small caliber rifle. Others were never recovered. All were vulnerable: sex workers, dancers, runaways. Hansen's name had surfaced before in assault and abduction complaints. Now there was a living witness describing his home, his plane, and his threats. The profilers took it all in.
Their assessment came back swiftly, and it was chilling. They believed the killer was methodical, organized, intelligent but socially awkward, someone with deep feelings of resentment, especially towards women, someone who appeared non-threatening, someone who hunted animals and people, and someone who likely escalated over time, growing bolder with each successful act. It was, they said, almost certainly the same person, and he would not stop on his own. The profile lined up almost perfectly with Robert Hansen. Meanwhile, Floth began digging deeper into Hansen's history. Court records showed a disturbing trend. Multiple charges in the 70s involving young women, including one who had escaped from his car and flagged down help. She had identified Hansen back then, but he'd taken a plea deal, no prison time. Floth interviewed past victims, spoke to people who knew him. He wasn't exactly popular, awkward, quiet, prone to anger when challenged. He kept trophies from hunting trips, and not just animal heads. Jewelry, watches, small keepsakes. No one thought twice about it. He was a family man, a baker. He volunteered at church. But under the surface, a different image was forming. A man with the means, the access, and the temperament to commit calculated violence. A man who flew alone into remote wilderness, often for days at a time. A man with an excuse for everything, and a growing number of coincidences pointing directly at him. Still, the legal wall remained. Cindy's testimony gave them motive. The profile gave them insight. But what they needed was evidence. Hard, physical, undeniable. Floth focused on the alibi. Hansen's friend John Henning had claimed he was with Hansen the morning of Cindy's escape. But when pressed further, the details got fuzzy. Henning admitted he hadn't actually seen Hansen until hours after the timeline Cindy described. The alibi was crumbling. That opened the door for a search warrant. It wasn't easy. The judge needed convincing, so Floth laid out the full picture: the matching plane description, the house layout, Hansen's prior convictions, the inconsistencies in his alibi, and the FBI's profile. The request was narrow, just the house and car, but it was enough. On October 27, 1983, the warrant was signed. The next morning, detectives prepared to search Robert Hansen's quiet suburban home. No sirens, no announcement, just calm procedure. They didn't know exactly what they'd find, but they were hoping for anything: a photo, a piece of jewelry, a map. Something that could pull this case out of shadow and into daylight. They were about to find far more than they imagined. October 27th, early morning, overcast skies. Detective Glenn Floth stood with a small team outside a modest ranch-style home in Muldoon, a quiet Anchorage suburb. The neighborhood was calm, lawns trimmed, driveways empty. From the outside, Robert Hansen's home looked like every other on the block. But Floth knew better. He held the freshly signed search warrant in his hand. Months of interviews, case files, and witness statements had led to this moment. It was time to see what Robert Hansen really was hiding. They knocked on the door. Hansen answered the door, still wearing his bakery uniform. Calm, mild, polite even. He said, "Yes, of course you can look around." He didn't ask what the warrant was for. Didn't argue. Didn't panic. As the detectives entered, they noticed how ordinary the house appeared. Family photos on the wall, children's toys in the living room, a bowl of rising dough on the kitchen counter. But then they went downstairs.
The basement was different. Dark, isolated, soundproofed. A thick metal support pole stood in the middle of the room. Next to it, a heavy chain anchored into the concrete floor. The pole matched Cindy Paulson's description perfectly. She had said she was shackled to it. Police noted the marks,
scratches on the pole, scuffing on the floor. On the shelves nearby were stacks of hunting magazines, boxes of ammunition, and a small collection of women's jewelry. No one in the house claimed ownership of those items. They were placed carefully, like trophies. Upstairs, detectives checked the bedroom. Inside a closet, beneath layers of winter coats, they found a hidden compartment. Inside it, a .223 caliber Mini 14 rifle. The caliber matched shell casings found near several remote graves. And then came the key discovery: a folded aviation map, well worn and marked. On it, dozens of tiny red X's had been drawn across remote Alaskan wilderness. Many were clustered near the Knik River and along the Susitna. Isolated spots only reachable by plane or with serious effort. Float knew instantly these were not hunting trails. They were grave markers. They took the evidence in quietly. No press, no headlines. Back at the station, Float laid it all out. The jewelry could belong to victims. The rifle matched ballistic evidence. The map could be the key to locating every body still unfound. And Cindy Paulson's story? It had been validated in almost every way. She had described the basement, the plane, even the animal trophies. There was no more room for doubt. But Float wasn't done. He ordered a search of Hansen's small Super Cub aircraft stored at Merrill Field. Inside, they found a survival kit, expected. Maps, emergency food, normal for Alaskan pilots. But in one side pocket, they found something else. More jewelry, rings, earrings, a bracelet, all women's. Float believed each item had once belonged to someone now missing, or worse. But still, Hansen denied everything. He was calm during questioning, but his stories began to shift. He admitted to meeting Cindy Paulson, but claimed she was lying. He admitted he owned the rifle, but said he used it for moose hunting. He couldn't explain the map except to say they were good fishing spots. None of it held up. Float requested full forensic analysis. Lab teams compared the jewelry to descriptions from families of missing women. They began matching bullets. They cross-checked flight logs, terrain, and the X's on the map with body recovery sites. And every day, the walls closed in a little more. The break was no longer theoretical. They had a suspect. They had a survivor. They had a weapon. And now they had a literal map of the crimes. But Hansen still did not confess. He seemed convinced he could hold the line. He'd done it before. But this time, the evidence was too much. The next step would be critical. Presenting it all to the grand jury and finally forcing Robert Hansen to speak. After the search of his home and plane, Robert Hansen was no longer a quiet, respectable baker. He was a suspect, a man whose life was slowly being pulled apart by the weight of the evidence. But even with the proof mounting against him, jewelry, firearms, the map, Hansen still denied everything. He remained calm, polite, and unyielding. He denied kidnapping Cindy Paulson. He denied even knowing her. He claimed the rifle in his basement was simply for hunting. The jewelry? Found it at the pawn shop. Nothing added up. But Hansen wasn't giving in. The following day, Detective Float sat across from him in the interrogation room. There was a tension in the air. The case had moved from speculation to certainty, and Hansen knew it. But still, he held on to his story, his demeanor never cracking. "You say you don't know Cindy Paulson," Float began, voice steady. "But we know that you do. We know she escaped from your house. We know she described your basement, your plane." Hansen was silent for a moment, as if weighing his words carefully. He wasn't rushing to defend himself. Instead, he was calculating, planning his next move. "I've told you everything I know," Hansen said finally. "This is just a misunderstanding. Cindy's making it up. She's trying to ruin my life." Float pressed harder. "You've been in trouble before, Robert. We know about the other women, the disappearances, the bodies." Hansen's eyes briefly flicked toward the table, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of breaking. "You're wrong. You don't know anything," Hansen replied, quietly. The hours dragged on. Float didn't break eye contact. Every so often, he'd repeat the same points. Cindy's escape, the forensic evidence, the map. Each time, Hansen's story remained the same. He knew nothing. But Float wasn't just waiting for a confession. He was looking for cracks. Anything that would betray Hansen's true self. And eventually, they came. It happened after Float played his trump card. "Robert, we have a problem here. We found something in your plane. Jewelry, rings, earrings, a bracelet, all women's." Float believed each item had once belonged to someone now missing, or worse. Hansen's eyes flicked nervously. His lips pressed into a thin line. "You've been taking trophies," Float continued. "You've been hunting women like animals. You've been marking the places you've buried them. We found the map, Robert. We know about the bodies. You're not fooling anyone." For the first time, Hansen's expression changed. His lips parted slightly. His breath quickened. The stoic mask was cracking. But he wasn't ready to confess. "I didn't do anything wrong," he said, his voice low and strained. "They were prostitutes. I just wanted to be left alone." Hours passed. It was almost 10 p.m. before Float left the room. But he wasn't done. He knew the pressure had worked. There was a hesitation now, a nervous energy he hadn't seen before. The next morning, Float returned with a new approach. He didn't ask questions. He simply laid out the evidence in front of Hansen. There was the map, marked with X's, the jewelry linked to missing women, the photos of the bodies found in remote locations, and the flight logs showing Hansen's trips into the wilderness. But still, Hansen said nothing. "I can't do this," he finally muttered after a long pause. Float stayed silent, letting the room grow heavy. "Why don't you just tell me what happened, Robert? You don't have to hide it anymore." Hansen finally spoke. The words came slowly, as if forced out of him. I never wanted to kill them. I just wanted control. They were always so unreachable, so hard to talk to. I wanted to make them listen to me."
His voice cracked. His hands were shaking. "Once I had them," he continued, "I couldn't let them go. I couldn't stop." The confession didn't come all at once. It wasn't like the movies where the killer spills everything in one moment. But little by little, Hansen began to piece together his story. He spoke of his life of rejection, of how he had always felt overlooked by society, by women especially. He spoke of his hunting trips, his obsession with trophies, and how that desire to control had transferred from animals to people. For the first time, he admitted it. "I hunted them," he said quietly. "They were easy targets. No one would care. No one would look for them." The truth hung in the air. Hansen had become the monster he had always feared, and now there was no more hiding. Detective Glenn Floth spread the map across the table once more. It was the same aviation chart they'd found hidden in Robert Hansen's bedroom, creased, marked, stained with use. Dozens of red X's were scattered across the wilderness surrounding Anchorage. Most of them were located in remote areas only accessible by plane, along the Knik River, the Matanuska Valley, the dense woods near the Susitna River. These weren't casual notations. Each X had been placed with precision, small enough to miss at a glance, but deliberate, intentional. Hansen had marked the spots where his victims lay buried. Now, Floth and his team faced a harrowing task. They had to match the map to the missing. The first step was to overlay the X's with locations where bodies had already been found. Some, like the remains discovered by hunters near Eklutna or the skeletal remains spotted by ATV riders, lined up perfectly. The pattern was undeniable. Wherever Hansen flew, death followed. Out of 24 red X's, only a handful had corresponding body recoveries. That left nearly 20 possible victims still unaccounted for. Some of the locations were miles from the nearest road. Others required bush planes or boats. All were hidden in Alaska's vast, unforgiving terrain. But Floth wasn't deterred. He assembled a team: state troopers, forensic technicians, cadaver dogs, and volunteer searchers. With winter approaching, the window to recover evidence was closing fast. The first search zone was a marked X along the Knik River. Cindy Paulson had mentioned Hansen saying he'd take her to his cabin there. Only later would it become clear that there was no cabin. There never had been, only wilderness. After hours of combing the area with dogs and ground teams, they spotted something: a partially buried shoe. Nearby, bits of torn fabric. And then bone. Human. Weathered. Long exposed to the elements. The victim was later identified through dental records. Sherry Morrow, a 23-year-old dancer who had vanished the year before. She had last been seen getting into a car near 4th Avenue. Now she was another grim confirmation of what the map represented. With that recovery, the tone of the investigation shifted. The map was no longer speculative. It was a ledger of murder. Each new X became a destination, and each destination brought heartbreak. At Horseshoe Lake, they found another shallow grave, this one belonging to Paula Goulding, a young woman from Florida who had come to Alaska for adventure and disappeared within weeks. The pattern was tragically clear. Hansen had selected women he thought no one would miss. He flew them to these remote places, then he hunted them. It was premeditated, calculated, cold. Not every site yielded remains. Some were too remote, the terrain too dangerous. But each journey deepened the case. Survivors' families were notified, cold case files were reopened, and each time the evidence confirmed Hansen's movements, Floth added another count to the growing indictment. Hansen, still in custody, was beginning to realize the magnitude of what was unraveling. He'd kept trophies, taken photos, recorded nothing in writing, except the map. It had been for him alone, a private ledger of his crimes. Now, it was the key to breaking the case wide open. During a second round of questioning, Floth confronted Hansen again. He brought out photographs of each recovery site, each matching an X. Hansen sat in silence, eyes fixed on the images. Finally, he nodded slowly. His voice was barely audible. "I marked them," he said. "I just wanted to remember where they were." It was the closest thing to remorse he would ever show. Floth knew there were more bodies out there. Maybe some would never be found. But the map had broken the silence. It had turned speculation into evidence.
and it had forced Robert Hansen to finally acknowledge what he had done. Now it was time to bring it all to court. The evidence against Robert Hansen was no longer circumstantial. They had the map, they had the rifle, they had the jewelry, and they had the bodies, several already recovered, more confirmed by Hansen himself. It was time to bring formal charges. Detective Glenn Floth worked with the district attorney's office to build the case. The legal team moved cautiously. Each detail had to be airtight, each accusation supported by physical evidence or testimony. This wasn't just about justice. It was about sending a message that even in the vast frozen wilderness of Alaska, someone was watching. On November 3, 1983, Robert Hansen was officially arrested and charged with multiple counts of abduction, assault, rape, and murder. The charges included the confirmed killings of Sherry Morrow, Paula Goulding, and Joanna Messina, whose remains had been recovered near Seward. Prosecutors also charged him in the assault of Cindy Paulson, whose escape had cracked the entire case open. But investigators were certain there were more. The grand jury proceedings began almost immediately. Prosecutors presented forensic reports, survivor testimony, and ballistic evidence tying Hansen's Mini-14 rifle to shell casings found near the bodies. The aviation map was the centerpiece. Dozens of red X's that Hansen had finally admitted were grave markers. The courtroom remained closed to the public during these early proceedings, but word had already spread. The media swarmed Anchorage. Reporters flew in from the lower 48. Headlines dubbed Hansen the Butcher Baker. Neighbors were stunned. Customers at the bakery recalled his soft smile, his quiet demeanor, his small talk about recipes and family. None of it matched the man now being described in court. People were horrified by the scale, not just the killings, but the planning, the control, the cruelty. The idea that someone could live a double life so convincingly shook the community. Even more disturbing was how long it had gone unnoticed. In jail, Hansen remained largely silent. He refused interviews. He didn't speak to reporters. He communicated with his lawyers but offered little in the way of explanation or apology. When pressed by investigators for full disclosure, names, locations, how many victims, he claimed he couldn't remember.
That it had all become a blur. Detective Floth didn't believe him. He believed Hansen remembered every detail, every name, every scream. As the prosecution built its case, they faced a dilemma. They couldn't prove every X on the map represented a murder. Not all had yielded bodies. Some victims had never even been reported missing. Floth estimated Hansen may have killed over 20 women. But in court, they had to work with what could be proved. So the prosecution focused on 4 confirmed murders and the assault of Cindy Paulson. In exchange for a full confession, they offered Hansen a deal: avoid the death penalty in return for cooperation. Hansen agreed. He sat in a quiet room with detectives and prosecutors and began to speak. He described how he would cruise Anchorage's red light district, offering women hundreds of dollars for a private session. Once inside his car, he'd pull a gun and handcuff them. He'd drive them to his home, keep them captive in his basement, sometimes for days. Then, when the time was right, he'd fly them deep into the Alaskan wilderness. He told them he'd pretend to calm their nerves, let them believe he'd let them go. But once they ran, he followed, rifle in hand, hunting them. His words were cold, clinical, no emotion. It wasn't revenge, he said. It was control.
Out there, he explained. They were in my world. When asked about the number of victims, Hansen hesitated, then answered simply, I lost count. He was charged with 17 murders. Floth believed there were more, but it was enough. Robert Hansen pled guilty to all charges. There would be no trial, only sentencing and silence. Even after Robert Hansen's confession, the search didn't stop. He had marked more than 20 X's on his aviation map. Only a fraction had yielded remains. Now, with winter closing in, the Alaska State Troopers raced to find whatever and whoever they could before snow buried the truth again. With Hansen's guidance, they revisited locations, remote sandbars, mossy creek beds, gravel pits deep in the forest. He no longer resisted. He didn't lead them, but he nodded when shown the map. Sometimes he corrected them when they guessed wrong. It was mechanical, methodical, like revisiting hunting spots out of habit, not guilt. One by one, they uncovered more bones. Some were complete skeletons. Others were fragments, scattered by animals or erosion, lost in the tundra. Angela Federn, Tamara Peterson, Sue Luna, Malai Larson. Their names had faded from police logs, many labeled as runaways or voluntarily missing. Now they had graves, and evidence that they hadn't vanished willingly. Each discovery brought closure to families who had waited years without answers, and with each recovered body, the case against Hansen grew monstrous. The final location was the hardest to reach. Deep in the Matanuska Valley, near a stretch of game trail only accessible on foot, searchers found one last set of remains. Buried under a shallow layer of rocks and earth, curled inward like a child sleeping. There were no dental records, no missing person report that matched. They listed her only as Jane Doe. Another life Hansen had taken. Another woman no one had noticed had gone missing. Back at the Anchorage Evidence Warehouse, the recovered items filled boxes. 21 confirmed victims. Dozens of personal effects, bracelets, necklaces, torn scraps of clothing. Shell casings tied to Hansen's rifle. Flight logs. The red-marked map. The basement pole from his home was entered into evidence. The chains, the tools. Every detail told the same story of a man who had built a second life around dominance, pain, and the illusion of invisibility. As detectives finalized the files for storage, Floth visited the basement one last time. The house had been emptied, the room stripped of evidence, but the stain of what happened there lingered. He looked at the bolt in the concrete floor, the hook in the ceiling, the faint outline of wear on the support post. This wasn't just a crime scene. It was a blueprint for how someone could build evil in plain sight. Robert Hansen was sentenced on February 18, 1984. For his confessed crimes, he received 461 years plus life without the possibility of parole. He was transferred to Spring Creek Correctional Center in Seward, Alaska.
He never left.